Alrighty, hello everybody. This is going to be a new video talking about the recent drip marking that we saw in one of the new Wuthering Waves trailers, especially the last scene. And in that kind of vein, I wanted to also talk about Huanglong in general and how it kind of links to China, because that's something I've never really talked about on the channel properly, but I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about it here because in order to learn about Mengzhou and Shuangfeng, which is the next two regions that we're going to be going to most likely, we need to also understand how Kuro has been constructing Huanglong, which is obviously based on China, and enter that kind of mentality in terms of the design language before we talk about anything next. So, if you weren't aware already, what we are going to be talking about primarily today, or focusing on, let me get my laser pointer up, is mostly going to be this scene you can kind of see in this GIF over here that showed up in Wuthering Waves' newest trailer, the second anniversary special cinematic. And of course, everyone was hyped up because we all know Luke told us we're going to Mengzhou next. But this is the first time we've actually seen something that may be linked to Mengzhou. However, we need to talk about some stuff beforehand. So, before we talk about what you guys are probably looking at this video for, which is the new region and stuff like that, we need to talk more about Huanglong in general, specifically about its symbolism, its references, as well as also its design language, as I said before. And I want to warn you guys, before we go into this video, we are going to be talking a crap ton about China and Chinese culture, even Chinese architecture within this video. So you're going to be entering, as you can see here, a very Chinese time of your life. And we are also going to be talking about some regions in Huanglong that we've already been to, namely Mount Firmament and Jinzhou, and talk about their design language and whatnot, stuff like that, in order to get into the mentality and the headspace of what Kuro has been doing in regards to linking real-life China to Huanglong. And then afterwards, we'll be talking about Shuangfeng and Mengzhou and basically theory crafting some stuff based on that. So that's going to be basically the thread of the video. But first things first off, we need to talk a little bit about Huanglong's inspiration in general, the whole region, not just the isolated cities. We know, for example, this should be common knowledge already, that Huanglong is split into 7 cities with Mingting as its capital, and it's also been, for example, quite hinted at recently that Rover was the one that created and demarcated, which is splitting Huanglong into 7 parts, demarcated Huanglong in the past. We know that because of the Huanglong map lore and also kind of like stuff like, all of this stuff in things about, the Qiankun and Pangu, which all come from real Chinese mythology, as well as also stuff like the Sentinels, because each city has a Sentinel, and we're going to talk about this later, but they are all based on the mansions of the Azure Dragon. If you want to learn more about like what Huanglong is about, because I'm not going to talk about Huanglong in detail, like we're focusing on the symbolism references, I recommend you watch Ancient's Huanglong video. He did a very extensive coverage of that, but there's some things else we need to focus on. First things first, we talk a little bit about, for example, Huanglong's founding myths, right? As we said before, Rover is very heavily inferred to be the figure that planned and demarcated Huanglong. We see, for example, here, it's an otherworldly figure with golden eyes, and Rover, through the words of Imperator, has been confirmed as working with the Sentinels to plan and basically provide birth to civilization, as you can see here. When you see, for example, a lot of the map lore and kind of like stuff that people have said, like Qixia and Yang have said about the founding of Huanglong, a lot of it is based on real Chinese mythology, like Pangu. Pangu was the figure that basically held up the heavens to prevent it from collapsing to Earth. If you want the TLDR, he's basically the Chinese equivalent of Atlas, who holds up the world, right? So one thing that we need to talk about with Huanglong as well is about the Sentinels, because the Sentinels are a very important part of not just Huanglong, but the whole world of Wuthering Waves. Huanglong is very unique among all the other countries because it has 7 Sentinels. And one thing that you may or may not know, I've talked about this quite a lot of times, is that all 7 of the Sentinels are based on the 7 mansions of the Azure Dragon. If you don't know what the fuck that means, that's completely fine because I'm going to talk about that in about 30 seconds, right? But you can see, for example, we know about 3 sentinels. We know about Zhui, which is Chao, was a horn. The first one, we also know about Fang, because Fang was mentioned by a student in Star Torch Academy, and there's a room. And we also know about Xin. Xin is going to be the next sentinel in Mengzhou, and that's going to be the heart, right? So if you don't know what the hell I was just talking about, I need to first introduce you to a Chinese concept of the 28 mansions, right? Because in Chinese mythology, we need to start from the basics, right? First off, a lot of Chinese mythology is based around the 4 cardinal compass directions. So you have, for example, like north, Beifang, and then you have east, Dongfang, and then you have basically south, Nanfang, and then you have west, which is Shifang, right? And each of these 4 cardinal directions have a specific animal that is basically attached to them. So for example, you have, the black tortoise of the north, you have the azure dragon of the east, vermilion bird of the south, and white tiger of the west. And every single cardinal direction has 7 mansions. Each beast has 7 mansions. And the reason why is because when you add all of these up together, you will get 28 mansions, and the ancient Chinese people believed that because it took the moon 27.3 days, they kind of like rounded it up to 28, right? 28 kind of days to complete a rotation of the Earth, it was believed that the moon, which is like a living entity, would live in a mansion per day. That's why they're called mansions, right? And the azure dragon, being one of the divine beasts, contains 7 mansions for 7 days of the moon's orbit around the Earth, right? And basically, we know, as we said on the previous slide, 3 of the sentinels of Huanglong we know about are based on the azure dragon's mansions. You have Chao or Zhui, you have Fang, which is just Fang, and then you have Xin, which is Xin, right? And basically, when you can kind of, like, what I just talked about is something I've illustrated here, right? These are the 7 mansions of the azure dragon, and you can see how each of these mansions that each sentinel was based on translates to a specific part of the azure dragon's body, right? You have, for example, the horn, which is like this first sector. You have the neck, which is this sector. You have the root, which is kind of like, it sounds weird, but it's basically the belly, right? The root. And then you have basically Fang, which is like the room. You have the heart, Xin, which is here. You have Wei, which is a tail. And you have Ji, which is really hard to translate in a way that sounds nice, but it's basically kind of like the dragon shit, right? The dragon poops, and then its poop is like fertilizer for that like lets crops grow in abundance. But it's like basically the very end, right? And as you can see here from the previous slide, the 28 mansions, the azure dragon occupies this sector, right? This sector over here, and this is what it looks like on basically a star map. So Huanglong is based on the 7 mansions of the azure dragon, or at least the sentinels are. So now that we've covered basically the symbolism of the sentinels, we need to get to basically the interesting part of the video. So we know that the sentinels and Huanglong in general are very heavily informed by Chinese inspirations, but one thing a lot of people don't really understand or know about is that a lot of the regions of Huanglong are also based on real places in China. And the reason why we know about this, the reason why I can actually make this conclusion in the first place, is because we have a place, specifically Mount Firmament, which is basically 100% confirmed to be based on a real Chinese place, which is Zhejiang, right? And there's a lot of evidence for this. I think if you are Chinese, it's a little more obvious, but I'll kind of like explain it in detail, right? The very strongest piece of evidence for Mount Firmament being based on Zhejiang is Changli's story. Because in Changli's story, when she grew up in Mount Firmament, she tells a story of a woodcutter and how they met 2 immortals playing Go. In Chinese, this is the story of the Lankeshan, right? Which is translated to the mountain of the rotten axe handle. If you want to learn more about that, I have a whole Changli video very conveniently about that. But the important part is that that story comes exclusively from Cuzhou in Zhejiang, right? The Lanka mountain from the story is also famous in Zhejiang because it had a stone chamber, and inside of that stone chamber, that was the cultivation area for a lot of immortals. The first immortal to go there was Qisongzi, and then afterwards, you have a lot of immortals that followed him to cultivate in that ancient stone chamber in the mountain. And the parallel I found for this is that if you remember, in Mount Thunman, there is also an ancient stone chamber where a giant beast is cultivating, which is the Mianlong chamber that Zhuwei is residing in, right? The other thing as well is that based on the story or the folktale of the Lankasan, we also have time freeze mechanics. One thing you may notice in a lot of the chrono sorters and devices built by the CSC in Mount Thunman is that they freeze time, they revert time and stuff like that. That's actually also based on the folktale, because in the folktale of the Lankasan, time is basically frozen on top of mountains, right? Next thing is that Zhejiang, because of this story, but also because of other things, is the spiritual home of Chinese chess, which is called Weiqi or Go, right? And that of course appears in Changli's story quite a lot. One thing that's probably not surprising to you is that Zhejiang is also very well known for mountains, right? 75% of its landmass is basically mountains. It's actually a joke that goes around in Zhejiang that it's like something along the words of 七分山10分水20分种地, right? Which basically is just 70% mountain, 10% water, 20% farmland, because Zhejiang has so many mountains, which makes sense because that's the inspiration that Mount Thunman comes from. As well as that, probably not surprising, you may remember if you play through Mount Thunman has a lot of hot springs, natural hot springs, right? Zhejiang also has hot springs, particularly in Qinghua, right? So, very interesting thing to kind of like think about. But this is really interesting because since Mount Thunman is so concretely based on Zhejiang, we can actually make some extrapolations about other places, right? For example, we can talk about, stuff like Jinzhou. But before we go on to that, I forgot to also show you guys, Lankashan, right, is actually a artifact of the Intangible Cultural Heritage Network, or ICH, in China. And it is, as you can see here, exclusively based in Suzhou, in Zhejiang. And also you can kind of see, this is Mount Thunman, this is Zhejiang. So you can kind of see the visual similarities between these two scenes. So, the next thing we can kind of make some extrapolations of is, of course, Jinzhou, right? Jinzhou is a bit harder because it's not as obvious as, oh, Mount Thunman is obviously based on Zhejiang. It's a bit harder to make an extrapolation, but I still have a theory. And my theory, first off, needs to talk a little bit about what the features of Jinzhou actually are, right? So we need to kind of like quickly run through some Jinzhou lore. I've kind of compiled it here so you guys don't have to go looking. But Jinzhou is the defensive capital of Outer Huanglong, and Outer Huanglong only has Jinzhou, right? Because every other city in Huanglong is in Inner Huanglong. And one thing that's very important is that several times in the lore, Jinzhou is called the throat of Huanglong as it defends the path into the country. You can look at that, for example, in the map lore, it says it several times. And because of that, it's been attacked by TD several times, and it's kind of like a battlefield war zone. That's why they literally have a Frenodian of war, or Overthrax, right? The city, you can kind of see on the map, is covered by a water moat on 3 sides and mountains to its back. You can even see the mountains over here. And other thing is that it's coastal, right? Jinzhou actually has access to a coast, so it's not like a landlocked city or a landlocked, province or whatever. It's basically kind of like has ocean access. That's why you can access the Black Shores and Renacida from Jinzhou. It also follows a very particular type of architecture, and we'll talk about this on the next slide, right? Because my predominant theory is that Jinzhou is based on the real Chinese province of Jiangsu, and on the next slide, I'll talk about all my reasons for why. And it's gonna get very deep into Chinese culture, so make sure you guys are prepared for that, okay? So, the first point we have to go through is Jinzhou's nature as a defensive capital. It's primarily made for defense of the newest city, and is considered the throat of Huanglong. And the first thing I need to talk about in regards to this very specific wording is that the throat is a very interesting term to use for a defensive capital, right? The fact that Jingzhou is constantly repeated as being the throat of Huanglong rather than the wall or a barrier is a very important differentiation you have to make, in my opinion, right? So first things first, we need to talk a little bit about the real inspiration, which is Jiangsu. So Jiangsu sits on the mouth of the Yangtze River, right? It controls the entrance or the literal throat to China's interior. It's where the Yangtze River meets the ocean. Jiangsu is also one of the most important defensive areas in China because since it has a very unique position amongst not just the entrance of the Yangtze River, but also the border or divide between the north and south of China, it blocks both the south and the interior of the country. So for instance, you may know about the city of Nanjing. The reason why Nanjing has been attacked like a million times is because it serves as the defensive throat for the whole country. It's surrounded on three sides by mountains, on one side by the Yangtze River, and it's very similar to Jingzhou because Jingzhou is surrounded by three sides by water and one side by the mountains, right? And as I said before, there is a very important differentiation to be made between something being the throat of defense in Chinese strategy, right? Because you may be asking, okay, if Nanjing is such an important city in China, and it was the ancient capital city, by the way, why is China's current capital Beijing, which is very far north of Nanjing? The reason for that is because Beijing was originally a capital that was pushed up further north in order to defend against the Mongol invasions. Beijing as a city is meant to be a barrier. It's a wall, right? That's why you have the Great Wall of China. It's a barrier city to prevent the invading forces from spilling into the rest of the country. But Jiangsu and Nanjing in extension is different. There's a difference between a wall, like a barrier, a wall, and the throat. If you capture Beijing, like China's administration is obviously very affected, but it's in big trouble. But if you capture Nanjing, China's kind of cooked, right? Because Nanjing is the entranceway into all of China's more vulnerable provinces in the interior and the south. So historically, that's why Nanjing has been China's capital, and it's been attacked several times, because if there is a city or a place in China that you could call the throat, historically, it has always been Nanjing in Jiangsu, right? So because of that, you can probably imagine Jiangsu has a really long history of defense and being under siege, very much like Jingzhou, which is the throat and the guard post for the rest of Huanglong. So much so that they have a Fernodian of war. And if you're, for example, wondering, yes, Beijing is the capital of China, but even today, China's ETC, or Eastern Theater Command, which happens to comprise of Jiangsu and Zhejiang, which is the two cities we talked about, the two provinces we talked about, have basically the strongest military concentration in the whole country, right? For all the reasons that we basically already talked about above. So from a defensive standpoint, Jiangsu is already the premier candidate for the inspiration of Jingzhou, but there's actually a bit more to it as well. The second point that I want to talk about is the architecture and the city style of Jingzhou, because besides the defensive considerations, a lot of Jingzhou's architecture is very reminiscent of the architecture in Jiangsu, right? So within Chinese architecture, this is a very generalized way of looking at it, but there's generally 6 styles, right? And in Jiangsu, you have 2 main styles. You have the native Su style and also the Hui style brought in from Anhui, which is the neighboring province from Jiangsu, right? And these 2 styles are dominant in Jiangsu because they're very similar to one another and they mesh very well together. So together, they're very well known, for example, for whitewashed walls. You have like curved and dark tiled roofs, and also a lot of integration, especially from the Su style, of water, ponds, rocks, carvings, and these winding paths, right? And if you look at, for example, these, like screenshots I've taken of Jinzhou, you can see there's already a lot of similarities, right? A lot of Chinese architecture outside of these two styles don't have these whitewashed walls and dark tiles, but as soon as you see Jinzhou, this is very apparent. A lot of Jinzhou's architecture is this color palette, white with black walls, because this is reminiscent of both the Hui and the Su styles that are apparent in Jiangsu. A lot of that as well, you have to consider, comes into play when you see that Jinzhou integrates a crap ton of water, right? On the outside, you have the moat, and on the inside, you have these like waterways and ponds, which is very reminiscent of like these like water gardens of the Su style. You can kind of see this parallel over here. Another thing is that in the Hui style, because the Hui style is very focused on carving and stonemasonry, there's a lot of Chinese guardian lions that are dominant in that style, and what would you know? Guarding the administrative center of the Jinzhou administrative kind of like palace or whatever, you have guardian lions, right? Jinzhou's gigantic administration building as well, I was kind of researching, looks a lot like the Ming Palace in Nanjing, because if you guys remember, Nanjing was the old capital of China. So there used to be a palace there, it's kind of ruined now, but there used to be a palace there, and you can kind of see a computer render of what that would have looked like, and you can kind of see, right, the style of even Nanjing as a defensive capital of China is very similar to Jinzhou, which is a defensive capital of Huanglong. It's just that even both of these cities are obviously built for defensive considerations. Nanjing is like kind of like surrounded by water on one side, looks like it's one side, right? Only because the city would be expanded later, and is surrounded by mountains on three sides. Jinzhou is surrounded by water on three sides and mountains on one side. So they're both very defensively oriented cities that even look very similar, right? Nanjing has the main palace kind of like situated near the back, like back towards the mountains. Jinzhou also has their palace situated like literally nestled towards mountains, right? So you can kind of see the similarities here already. The other thing we can kind of consider when it comes to Jinzhou being Jiangsu is very simple. Since we know that Mount Firmament is based on Zhejiang, it's very interesting that Jiangsu is right next to Zhejiang. This is not a very strong point by any means, but I thought it'd be kind of like interesting to put in. Anyways, so at this point of the video, I would not blame you for saying like, oh, Pingu, like, I don't think Kuro is thinking that deep, like, who the hell cares about, real life architectural styles in a gacha game? And to be honest, for most people, I think that's completely fair, but I want you guys to remember that this is far from the only time that Kuro has utilized real life architectural styles within the design language of the game. One of the examples I like to really show everybody when they ask me this question is Portovino Castle, right? Portovino Castle, which is like Cantarella's residence, if you guys didn't know, is really heavily based on the Iberian Manueline style, the Portuguese Manueline style. You can see the inspiration here. This is Portovino Castle, and this is Neo-Manueline architecture. And what's really interesting is that the reason why it's so easy to see that it's based on the Manueline style is because the rest of Rinascita, like Ragusa, is based in the Renaissance Italian style, because Ragusa is based on Renaissance Italy. The Montellis are Italian because they're based on the real Medici family, and the Thessalias are Spanish because they're based on the real Borgia family. So Cantarella, if you guys still do not believe it, is even based on like a poison that only the Borgias are rumored to have used. You can search up Cantarella's name and what it means. It's a very specific poison. So anyway, oh my god, would you happen to look at that? It's almost like, there's like a whole video that explains basically what I just said. So anyway, if you guys are curious into talking about, for example, the Medicis, the Borgias, the Manueline style, Renaissance Italy and whatever, I do have a whole Cantarella video here that explains everything. So if you guys want to have a look at that, feel more than free to do so. But anyway, back to China. So this is the part of the video that most of you guys are probably waiting for, and that is going to be the drip marketing that was just revealed. So before we go into kind of analyzing everything about it, we need to talk about some things, right? So first things first off, I think this is a bit of a misconception a lot of people have, that people think that, oh, this is Mengzhou, but I don't actually think that's the case, right? Because if you have a quick look at Buling's law, you'll know that there's actually a little land or a province in between Jinzhou and Mengzhou, and that is the land of Xuanfang, right? Xuanfang is kind of like the passageway between Mengzhou and Jinzhou, and you can actually know that if you look at the Jinzhou law, because when Jinzhou was being defended by the six cities had to send forces through Xuanfang, right? So even though it's not confirmed, I am basically 85% sure that we are going to be going to Xuanfang first before we go to Mengzhou, right? So I think that this place is a lot more akin to Xuanfang, because Mengzhou, you know, this feels kind of small for if this was actually Mengzhou, right? So I think this is Xuanfang basically. So if this is Xuanfang, then there's some things that we can talk about, right? The very first, most obvious thing that stands out to me is these mountain pillars, right? And these mountain pillars are actually very unique. If you're Chinese, you would know what these are almost instantly, because these are the sandstone mountain pillars in Sangjia. I can't speak. Zhangjiajie. Yeah, okay, that's how you call it. Zhangjiajie. So these are the mountain pillars in Zhangjiajie, and the way they were kind of created is that basically they were made of sandstone. The sandstone eroded away because of wind and water, and you're only left with the core, like rock of the mountain. There's basically only one place in China that has these, so we already know it's based in this national park, which is based in Hunan province, which actually makes a lot of sense, because if you also look at, for example, the architecture, what the buildings look like, they look a lot kind of different from Jinzhou, right? They're a bit similar, they're a little bit also different from Jinzhou, right? So a couple of things we need to take into consideration. In this picture, if you guys didn't notice already, this city is floating. It's not actually, you know, like for example, built into mountains or whatever, it's floating. And the color palette of the buildings and stuff is a bit different. So Jinzhou, as we said before, is predominantly black and white, right? Whitewashed walls, black tiled roofs. But in this kind of like, you know, city, we see a lot more brown and kind of like modern architecture and stuff like that in glass, right? Brown architecture. And the reason why I think that's the case is because if this is based on Hunan, which I'm pretty certain it is based on these mountains alone, Hunan has a lot of different architectural styles from a lot of different ethnicities and kind of like neighboring provinces, but the dominant style is the native Shang style. And the Shang style focuses on timber construction, particularly long-standing timber construction that is built into mountainsides and rivers, because Hunan has a shit ton of mountains, right? And what you can expect from the Shang style and Hunan's architecture in general is you have really tall structures like this, you have massive roofs, because you have this thing called the Chuandou interlocking style, which is a kind of construction method which completely is, the whole point of it is just to support a massive roof, right? So this is like the Chuandou style, completely just uses wood, no cement, nothing, just interlocking wood. So you have like timber, you have all this up on mountains, and you can see how, for example, Xuanfang, a lot of it's more brown than Jinzhou because of perhaps like more wood construction. And the core philosophy of the Shang style is that you build and kind of live within the mountains. And I think that Xuanfang, kind of like this floating city, is a very sort of like modern interpretation of that. It's literally a city floating amidst the mountains, yeah? So that's my guess currently for what the drip marketing is, but of course there's one more question left unexplained, because if this is Xuanfang, then we still have to talk about Mengzhou, right? So just running off of a couple of things we know about Mengzhou, I compiled this information from a lot of places, so you guys don't have to do a lot of reading by yourself, but some things we know about Mengzhou, right? Sorry, it's a very boring slide, but first things first off, Luke has told us that the Court of Cervantes committee has built a city in Mengzhou, so there's probably a lot of ancient stuff and kind of remains from the CSC, right? We also know, if you click on like the Mengzhou glossary, that a lot of commerce and Taoism are big parts of the city's environment design. They coexist. The Sentinel is Sin. I think it's not confirmed, but it's like, I'm kind of like 99% sure it's Sin, right? And a lot of the people under the direction of the Sentinel have developed unique automata mechanics. Also, it has abundant waterways, thriving greenery, and enchanting landscapes. Wuling, which a lot of this information about Mengzhou comes from Wuling's story, describes Mengzhou as having endless water. So waterways, endless waters, and it most likely has mountains because it borders Shuanfeng, and we know that Wuling's temple in Mengzhou was on a mountain. The other thing is that Wuling's favorite food is shredded fish noodles, which are a Mengzhou specialty. So that's all of the current information that we basically have on Mengzhou so far. So you guys are probably like kind of like thinking, okay, based on this information, surely, Penguin, you have a bit of a guess for where this is based on in China. And I do. However, I want you guys to take this a bit of a tinfoil grain of salt, tinfoil hat, because this is a kind of like whack theory, right? I think that Mengzhou is most likely going to be based so far on Hubei. And I've already listed the reasons why I think it's Hubei, based on kind of like everything I talked about on the right-hand side. But just going to be rapid firing this. First things first off, fish noodles, right? Hubei has a lot of fish because it has a lot of water. And there's a lot of fish dishes, freshwater fish dishes, and Hubei even makes fish noodles, which is basically, you beat fish meat into dough to make noodles made out of fish, if you guys can understand what that means, right? And the other thing that's pretty important is that Wuling, we already know, is big on Taoism. There's also Taoism described as being very integral to Mengzhou, and there's like temples, of course, right, in the mountain ranges. And one of the things about Hubei is that Hubei has one of the holiest places of Taoism, which is a lot of the temples and the mountain itself of the Wudang mountain range. This is one of the holiest places of Taoism, and if Wuling's temple is on a mountain, this is kind of like the most famous Taoism site you can probably cite in all of China, right? As you can probably imagine, Hubei has a lot of mountains. Hubei actually has tons of mountain ranges. A lot of the provinces around Hubei have a lot of mountains, but anyway, Hubei is also very well known for having a metric crap ton of water. It does not have sea access, but it has a lot of lakes, it has a lot of rivers, and the Yangtze also flows through Hubei, right? The other thing that kind of links to the whole idea that, you know, the court of Cervantes built a city under Mengzhou was that I found it very interesting. Hubei has the ruins of the ancient city of Jingzhou. So Jingzhou is not Jinzhou from Wuthering Waves, but Jingzhou with a G. And even though Jingzhou is a currently existing city, we're talking about ancient Jingzhou, which is kind of like in ruins right now. And it was one of the most important areas of not just China, but also, you guys may know this, the Three Kingdoms period, right? Because, for example, in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Jingzhou is the subject of over 70 chapters of the book. That's how important it is in China. And following the Three Kingdoms period, Jingzhou has oftentimes been talked about as the residences and also declared by a lot of illegitimate princes and royal figures, whatever, as the capital of China. It's a very important part of China, which is unfortunately now kind of sitting in half ruins, right? So I thought that was very interesting link to the CSC, because if you're talking about an ancient ruins in like these like ancient cities are really important, but currently are not really present in China, then Jingzhou is probably one of the top contenders, right? The other thing is that Hubei is also incredibly important for commerce. It still is very important today, but it was very historically important because Hubei was in past called the thoroughfare of the 9 provinces. And what that basically means is that because Hubei sits on the intersection between the Yangtze and the Han River, a lot of like the goods and the products from the other provinces kind of behind and around it have to first go to Hubei before it's sent to other places. So for example, in ancient times, nearly all of China's tea exports to all Western countries ran through Hubei, right? Because it's essentially a massive transit hub. And we know that Mengzhou is really big on commerce as well as Taoism. So when you put all these points together, this is probably, in my eyes, currently the biggest, most likely contender, but we don't really know for sure, right? So if you enjoyed this video, hopefully this didn't take too long, but as usual, hopefully you enjoyed it. If you have any kind of observations or questions or whatnot, feel free to put them in the comments. But as always, hope you guys have a great rest of the day. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe or become a channel member, or even send me a donation for comments. That'd be much appreciated. But as always, have a good one, and I'll see you guys in the next video.